Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Matthew Brogdon. I've got a special guest today, Paul Carrese, who is the Civic Thought and Leadership Fellow at the Jack Miller Center for the Teaching of America's Founding Principles and History. He's also the founding director of the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, which has been an important sort of path-breaking example to institutions that are committed to civic education in the United States, and an important inspiration to the work we do here at the Center for Constitutional Studies. We're going to talk today about George Washington's presidency. George Washington, the indispensable man of the founding, the father of his country, earned that title first as a military leader in what was a very contingent and uncertain revolution for America's independence. He sat in the front of the room in that chair with the rising sun over his head in Philadelphia as the Constitution was drafted, including the provisions for the American presidency. When the framers were fleshing out the shape of that institution, there was the man who would occupy it first, and of course occupied that position already in the minds of many of the framers of the Constitution, and most importantly for us, was the country's first president, and in that role established the contours and constitutional shape of that office and set a precedent that casts a long shadow over American constitutional and civic life. So Paul, let's talk about Washington. I want to ask first, Washington becomes president in 1789 in a context where most American executives are pretty weak. There were counterexamples, but the only strong executive most Americans were acquainted with would have been monarchs. And anti-federalists had been arguing that not that Washington, but that the presidency, a strong executive like the presidency, was inconsistent with the Republican government. So how, in taking up the mantle of the presidency, did Washington meet this challenge?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting me for the interview. I'm an admirer of all the work you are doing at the Center for Constitutional Studies and with undergraduate students here at UVU and with teachers, and it's just marvelous work. The story of Washington making the single executive legitimate is a story of Washington being invited to the Constitutional Convention because he'd been a leader in the arguments for reform of the Articles of Confederation. And not very widely known, he writes a letter to James Madison in March of 1787, before the convention begins in May. I would translate it in modern terms as, I don't want this to be a talking shop and a waste of time. We need to do real work. The language he uses is that radical cures of the Articles of Confederation are needed, and this will take thought. And he knew that Madison could do the thinking. Well, Madison was already working on basically what we would call the Virginia Plan, right? But now he has the authority of the big guy, the most respected man in the country, who had resigned from public life after defeating a superpower. So he was not going to be the Cromwell figure or later the Napoleon figure, right? So he's got great legitimacy. He brings that legitimacy to the convention publicly, but privately he's already told Madison, think big. So Madison proposes an independent executive in the Virginia Plan. But there he is present. Then he's nominated basically by Franklin at the very beginning to be the presiding officer, the president of the convention. And he doesn't get enough credit for making it a serious endeavor because he doesn't speak. He thinks it's his role not to speak very much. He says that on the final day. Mm-hmm. I thought I should not speak very much. You should be presiding. But he keeps them, he's there every day. He keeps them there every day. He keeps them to the rule of secrecy. So he makes it possible for there to be Article 2 in all kinds of ways. And they all know in the room that he's the model for it. So when he agrees to the unanimous vote in the Electoral College to serve, he already has all of that legitimacy behind him. And he shows by his deeds, by his first inaugural address to my fellow citizens in the Senate and House of Representatives, that he will be a constitutional executive. And he shows the value of it year by year by not being a monarch, right? The Anti-Federalists say this office is the fetus of monarchy, right? He shows that he is independent where the Constitution says he should be independent with the executive power, but collaborating with the other branches where he needs to collaborate. There's a sticky point about the treaty power between the Senate that works out.
We'll have to come back to that.
But he shows year after year that he is not a monarch, that he's guided by the Constitution. This is an office he's holding under the Constitution, and he's showing the value of it. The economy improves, the legislation working out with Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, other things, So by the end of his first term, he asked Madison to write what we would now call the farewell address, a statement of valedictory address, he calls it to Madison. Madison says, I don't want to do this, but I will, because he wants to resign. It's like successful. I've shown that this works. I can leave. Can't I retire, right? And Madison says, I don't want to do this. They all unanimously, the party factions thing has already started with the French Revolution. All of them separately write or signal to him. Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Adams, they all say, you cannot leave. And so he has Madison's draft and he just puts it away and is unanimously elected a second time, unanimously, in the Electoral College to be president.
That's a remarkable thing.
So to discipline himself, to say, I'm serving the Constitution, and to show that in his public statements, in his private negotiations and actions, he was abiding by the Constitution and doing the functions the office was needed to do to provide some executive energy, but especially about foreign affairs, but not only about foreign affairs. He proved the value of it right away, such that there was no dissent from anywhere on the thought that he would be elected again for a second term.
And it's not surprising that he's elected unanimously the first time around, but to win re-election in that fashion. You speak of Washington's conception of the presidency as an office, and I've heard you talk before about the provenance of that term of office, that Washington's not just drawing guidance from the Constitution, from that work of the framers in the 1780s, but he's actually drawing inspiration from an understanding of public service that's much older than that, including from someone like Cicero, who writes of duties. Actually, I guess Cicero's, one of his most important works on public service, on duties, we usually interpret it, is actually De Officiis, the offices. So maybe you could help us understand that. How is it that Washington draws inspiration from these older classical sources when it comes to the way he exercises powers and understands his role as president?
A great resource is a book written by Richard Brookhiser, longtime editor for National Review, and it was the first of his series of biographies of founders, Madison and John Quincy Adams and Hamilton. But the first one from the 1990s is Founding Father, and the subtitle is Rediscovering George Washington. He says this very explicitly in the first one. He's writing a Plutarchan biography, a character study. It's not a 1,000-page biography study of Washington. Those had already been done. And John Marshall's first biography was very long in the first effort, then Marshall shortens it, and at the end of his life, Marshall shortens it again to a one-volume study,
I think
which is
we've
wonderful.
got his Marshall's one-volume biography down here on the table.
That's right.
Which was used for school children.
He wrote it in sort of somewhat in desperation under the Jacksonian democracy era, thinking the real story of the founding and of constitutionalism and the republic might be lost. So he reduces his own
4 volumes?
life. It was initially in 5 volumes. Then Marshall reduces it a few years later to 2-volume and shorter in length. And then 30 years later, at the end of his life, it actually comes into print after Marshall has died, 1838. But the subtitle of it now is The Life of George Washington Written for Schools. Right? So I say those are the 2 best biographies in my view. And I haven't read every single one, but Marshall's, especially the final one, his final condensed essence of Washington and his greatness, his constitutional greatness. This is the great Chief Justice John Marshall, right? And then Richard Brookhiser, a character study, reading all the other biographies and histories and all that stuff. But the point, to get back to your question, is that Brookhiser takes very seriously that Washington was self-educated to agree that most of us, political science, history, we don't appreciate it. He had 900 volumes in the Mount Vernon Library at his death, some that he inherited from his father and his older brothers, and they weren't all about agriculture and military affairs. He had his own copy of Cicero's De Officiis. He may even have more than one, but he's definitely got one in translation on duties. He has Plutarch. He has Grotius on the rights of war and peace, the first major comprehensive work of international law, we would call it, right? Who is this dumb general with spending money on these books? So between his own reading, and then Brookhiser makes a great point, having the confidence with his own efforts at self-education, not being able to go to college, he has the confidence to be writing back and forth with talking to very smart people, George Mason, then Thomas Jefferson, then James Madison, then Alexander Hamilton, then John Jay, then John Adams. Imagine having the intellectual confidence to want Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in your cabinet, already sensing these are two very different characters. And then after year one in the cabinet, these are very, very different characters. He wants them to stay in as long as possible. And after they've left, he's still writing to both of them, and with Madison. And so he had a liberal education more than we give him credit for. He spent the money on the books to do that. He's writing to these smart people. And he absorbs, he's a wonderful emblem of, but embodiment of, the liberal arts education that all these great learned founders we have, we think of that whole list I just gave, it all comes to a consensus in him. So when you read a document that you say, well, it was ghostwritten, the first inaugural was ghostwritten by Madison, and the farewell address in 1796 was ghostwritten by Hamilton. It was actually ghostwritten at Washington's insistence by Madison, because he says to Hamilton in 1796, you must use as much as you can of Madison's draft from 1792. And then at the end of a process of going back and forth with Hamilton, he finally likes the version that Hamilton has sent him. He says, I would like you to show this to John Jay. And so Washington brings back, to use a Blues Brothers metaphor, probably nobody gets that, Washington brings the band back together. He brings Publius from the Federalist Papers back together on his own initiative. That the ideas of Hamilton and Madison and Jay inform the farewell address. So the word office is used in the farewell address. He also uses the word trust about this office, right? I'm serving the Constitution. He takes very seriously the oath of the Constitution and refers to it. That he's serving the Constitution, obviously his independent judgment has to be used, but he's serving an office, it's a duty. He uses these words regularly. And that is not the predominant understanding of holding office today. We use words like public servant, not really tracing it back to this Ciceronian idea. And we think of administration, and we think of executive authority, but we don't trace those back to the deeper ideas which inform but also bind and limit those. But Washington is using those words all the time in private correspondence, in public writing, and public addresses.
It is a remarkable element of his presidency that he thinks of the role in the office as a set of duties, and especially the duty to faithfully execute the laws, of course, in the presidential oath, faithfully executing the laws and protecting, defending, preserving the Constitution. I think it'd be helpful to talk about some particular episodes to get an idea of how Washington, in practice, understood and interpreted the powers of the presidency, because it's fair to say that he was a strong president. He certainly had a conception of the presidency as constitutionally limited, but also exercised the powers quite vigorously. So I think that would be helpful to play that out, to tease that out by talking through some of these. I think there are three especially that are worth us touching on. The controversy over the Bank of the United States, which he oversees as president and brings into creation. The Jay Treaty with Great Britain, which embroils him again, like it had with the Neutrality Proclamation, in the exercise of presidential discretion in foreign affairs, and then the Whiskey Rebellion, which is a thing that I think a lot of people don't know a great deal about, but was a fascinating episode. So why don't we tackle those one at a time? Maybe walk me through how Washington's leadership as president in the bank controversy helps us see his conception of the office.
Wonderful question. The rationale for the bank is to strike the right balance between liberty and a small but vigorous federal government with an executive branch that has military capability, right? So you want liberty, therefore small government, right? Therefore, you don't want a large standing army and standing navy. The language in the Constitution about the Navy is to provide for and maintain a Navy, right? Which means it's permanent, okay? And then to raise armies, temporary, right? But Washington is persuaded by Hamilton that the English have a good idea. They mostly have a small standing army and a permanent Navy. But the bank, for centuries, had allowed the British to, in emergencies, fund men and material for an army and also to boost the Navy. That allows there to be liberty at home with the capacity that is a signal to potential enemies. You really don't want to risk this, do you? Because we have enough of a standing Navy and standing army, and we have the bank capacity. This is really not a good bet for you, is it, Mr. Monarch, Mr. Empire, Mr. Whoever, right?
What was the Churchill's term? The America's the arsenal of democracy. What do you think of this?
The bank allows that capacity without having a big, standing, permanent, small. The shell, the capacity is there, and then you fund it quickly in an emergency, right? So he's persuaded by Hamilton, and he's persuaded by Hamilton that part of Washington's genius is he really uses the cabinet to bring in excellent people who have strong opinions. Just think of Hamilton and Jefferson, the two, right? Mm-hmm. As if Hamilton and Jefferson are not smart enough, he's writing privately to Madison in the House. So he wants the best opinions, and then he makes his own judgment. And he's persuaded by Hamilton that the necessary and proper clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8 is there for a reason. It can't be a vacant clause. They knew what they were doing, and he was there when it was written in the convention. This is a necessary and proper step, the bank, to implement some of the clauses above. National security rationale, other rationales. So he's persuaded. That's the reason he wants a national university as well. Right?
Something we don't talk about often, his desire for a national university.
For all 8 years of his presidency, he asked the Congress for a national university, right? So he's persuaded by that. And let me just say about why he was proven correct. James Madison, opposing the bank, admits silently by 1815 that Hamilton and Washington were right. Never admits it, but Madison suddenly discovers the bank is constitutional. Why? Well, the national capital was invaded and burned in 1812 because there was no standing army. There was a rowboat navy, it was called. It was a joke, right? Jefferson didn't want the taxes, didn't want a strong federal government. We've got an ocean. We don't need all this meddlesome, strong, monarchical federal government thing, right? Well, after 12 years of that, the British are pushing us around like we're nothing, and we are nothing, right? So we get ourselves into a war that we didn't need to get ourselves into. What Washington and Adams together had avoided for 12 years, suddenly the Jefferson Democratic Republican administrations get us into, because we have no army, no navy, and no bank, right? So after the national capital is invaded and burned in that war, they bring back the bank. They fund an army capability and a navy capability much more than they had. And by 1819, there's a de facto naval academy in Annapolis. Not under that precise title. It isn't formally established until 1840, but it's there. So the bank was eventually recognized, even by Madison, as necessary for national security, because ugly experience had proven the wisdom of the Washington-Hamilton strategy.
I'd never connected. I teach the national bank controversy to undergraduates a great deal, and I usually put it in the context of Hamilton's economic program, tariffs, and assumption of state debts and its economic health. But it is a really critical connection that the bank is a financial institution that's really essential to the national security of the United States, which something I always have observed with students whenever we go through Hamilton's writings is just how much he does acknowledge the economic basis of military power.
It connects to the Jay Treaty because I think it's fair to say that today we think Washington's not very smart. He was important and established these precedents, but it's smarter people informing him. And he has successful 8 years. But Adams is implementing the Washington-Hamilton strategy for the next 4 years. So we have 12 years in which this infant government, nothing like it ever in the history of humankind, stays out of the French Revolution and the wars of Europe, has a booming economy, it is thriving and has the capacity to expand. The Generalissimo, who could have stayed in office till death, resigns, wants to get out of there after 4 years, is out of there after 8, survives the birth of parties and a party transition, and is still strong enough after, you can see I'm being a little critical of Jefferson and Madison as presidents, is still strong enough to survive the War of 1812. Which did not need to be fought. We shouldn't have been pulled into. Capital invaded and burned, and it survives it. Then goes on to come up with an accommodation between the Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison views about all of this and moves on into the rest of the 19th century. It's astounding. But Washington, I think, doesn't quite get enough credit.
Yeah.
Washington and Hamilton together for laying the foundations. What does Article 2 mean? What does Article 1 mean? Let alone what does Article 3 mean? And how to make this real and successful and a model elsewhere.
So the Jay Treaty, how does it establish the constitutional role of the president diplomatically? So, I mean, this is very important. We now think of the president as obviously sort of the first diplomat of the nation, as well as commander-in-chief. So it's very natural for Americans now to think of the presidency in this position. But not everyone thought of executives, especially Republican executives, as being able to wield that kind of power in foreign relations and at the same time remain elected Republican officers. So how did Washington's use of this power, his navigation of foreign affairs, especially with the Jay Treaty, maybe with other things, establish his understanding of the constitutional scope or duties of the president?
The bank controversy shows this same issue of constitutional understanding, and then the Jay Treaty, another episode. We, from the 20th century into the 21st century, have fallen into the lazy, unconstitutional view of thinking the judges decide the meaning of the Constitution. Well, the great Chief Justice John Marshall did establish for unanimous court that the court does have an important role, but not an exclusive role. Mm-hmm. Washington, the cabinet, the leaders in the House and Senate are working out the meaning of crucial clauses in Article 1 and Article 2, and to some extent Article 3, as constitutional interpreters. And I give them Madison has his reasons to say the bank's not constitutional, and Jefferson as well has. These are reasonable concerns that they have. I think they were wrong, but the Jay Treaty, the treaty power, Washington, the cabinet, leaders of the Senate don't quite know what these clauses are about the advise and consent role of the Senate in relation to the executive. There's an episode where Washington goes in person to the Senate, thinking that advise and consent means he's proposing a treaty and thinks at the beginning of the process he needs to be working with the Senate on what the terms would be, and finds it completely frustrating, mm-hmm. and walks out, kind of storms out, and basically never returns in person, figuring out to himself this can't be mm-hmm. ever what was intended, because nothing would ever get done. So there has to be an executive who drives the diplomacy and the treaty process. And then there's a possibility for some consultation with leaders in the Senate, and that's all a matter of prudence. But then the formal role is for the Senate to accept that the executive has negotiated a treaty on the premise that he thinks he's read the Senate and that this is acceptable. to a supermajority. And that's what happens with the Jay Treaty. The controversy, the storm of controversy because of the French Revolution, and should America be more with France and republicanism or with monarchy and Britain and all that? Washington just says, I'm executing my constitutional role. I have assigned the Foreign Secretary of the Articles of Confederation government, John Jay, who's now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, for this role. And it's not an official role. It's not violating the Constitution that Jay is holding two roles, right? And I trust him. And because there are no smartphones, there are no faxes, there are no satellites, he's just got to send Jay off on a ship and go negotiate and trust him, right? And I will have done my duty, George Washington, to review what Jay comes back with and say, I trust Mr. Jay. This is the best we could have gotten. This keeps us out of war. This affirms our independence. And I will send it to the Senate. Well, storm of controversy breaks out. The House wants to get involved, and they want to see all the negotiating documents. And Washington just says, I'm reading the Constitution. I don't see any role for the House in a treaty. Of course, there's an indirect role in appropriating funds, things like that. But they don't confirm anybody involved in the process, and they're not involved in the crucial language of Article 1 and Article 2. So he says, this is between the Senate and me. And, all kinds of outrageous things happening, and John Jay being burned in effigy, and, party and all this sort of stuff. And Washington just keeps his cool and says, I'm doing what the Constitution says should be done. And the Senate will have to decide, but his firmness gives just enough authority and cover to the Senate that they say, we accept the views of the president that Mr. Jay negotiated the best that we could get. And what does it do? It keeps us out of the wars of Europe and affirms our independence in a way that the Treaty of Paris is now being followed up by this second treaty with Britain. And look at what it did. It did exactly what Washington said it was going to do. But it was his internal debate with the cabinet, then with reading the Senate and saying, this is what the Constitution meant to do. What's hard for us is that there's an aristocratic quality to this. The Senate is a Roman Republican term. It's not a Democratic term. The executive acting this way is a semi-monarchical role, office function. And we are not so comfortable. And at the time, members of the House weren't comfortable with it. And the parties, the Democratic Republican Party out there is not comfortable with it. Yeah. But the wisdom of it and the constitutionality of it, I think, was proven.
Makes me feel like we need an episode at some point talking about, not undemocratic institutions in democratic society, and including the military, of course, how you do this. And we just talk about John Ford Westerns, I think, and get. But the Washington can't ride off to London to negotiate the Jay Treaty. He can, however, go out to Western Pennsylvania to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. So acquaint us briefly with what occurred in the Whiskey Rebellion and how that shaped Washington's understanding of the presidency, or indicates for us the kind of precedent he set.
It's related to these two episodes we just discussed, the bank and the treaty power, and the earlier discussion about office and constitutionalism. Washington thinks we are a constitutional republic. He is enough of a literal reader of the Constitution, which only uses the word Constitution and Republic. It does not refer to democracy, right? Mm-hmm. This is the form of government we have. They know the distinction between a democracy and a republic. Now, there's some, Danielle Allen of Harvard argues, well, they were using both terms and somewhat interchangeably. I lean on the side that is partly correct, but still, the greater emphasis is on the distinction between the two. Under the authority of the Constitution as a republic, it was legitimate to pass the legislation about a tax. The federal government had that power. This is all part of Hamilton's, financial scheme, but there's enough consensus in the cabinet. Washington goes forward with it. It's passed into law, and these are the laws of the land, and it's all legitimate in letter and in spirit, right? The Whiskey Rebellion is, in Washington's mind, something of a reprise of an echo of Shays' Rebellion in the immediate period before the 1787 Constitution. A major reason the Federal Convention was called in Philadelphia in 1787. This rebellion in 1786, right, is it, in Massachusetts, in which farmers, upset at the tax and finance policies of the state of Massachusetts, claiming they're in debt, they can't repay their loans, so they're just storming. They form a militia Shays is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And Washington, writing from Virginia, is just horrified at this. This is a further reason for him that we must gather a convention to reform and revise the Articles, because the Articles government is helpless. It can't come up with the right finance, tax, tariff, international, and domestic policies to deal with these economic issues which are causing violence. Okay? So it's a reprise for him of the very reason why you needed Article 1, Article 2 in a new constitution. We followed the letter of the law. We are now going to enforce the letter of the law. It's a sticky moment because he's the civilian commander-in-chief, but he's the most famous general of the right on the continent. And he decides he should ride out. He decides diplomacy, right, as much as he can, send a signal. But then the diplomacy is not working. And, you know, federal tax collectors are being tarred and feathered and chased out and violence and all that. So he just decides we have to exercise the constitutional powers he has to call out the state militias as a federal force. And he gets the cooperation of these several states to do it, all under the Constitution. And then decides he should show up in person. Not in uniform.
Not in uniform.
As a civilian and far enough away from it's just where the gathering is. Mm-hmm. And then the force goes off. Well, what happens? There's no bloodshed. Not a single shot is fired. It's the same strategy he has for the bank. If we show enough force, foreign powers will decide, not a good bet, too risky. I'm not going to try something on the Americans, right? All the rebels against the tax disappear. Not a shot is fired, and eventually compliance with the tax follows.
So Washington's peace through strength.
Peace through strength. On domestic policy, and to show he writes about it in his annual address reporting to Congress, this was a test of our constitutional form of government and whether self-government could follow the rule of law. And we passed the test.
Okay, so
Tough character.
He is.
And you're Republican, not Democratic. Constitutional, not Democratic.
To bring us to a close appropriately, Washington's farewell address, he warns against the spirit of party. He warns Americans to revere their laws and constitutions, and warns them to maintain, the importance of character and morality in national politics. And clearly he had modeled many of those things himself, but he had also been, in many ways, a party leader. He was the Federalist president by the time he left office. He hands off the mantle of the presidency to John Adams. It's always been a peculiar thing that we refer to Jeffersonian Republicans, but not Washingtonian Federalists. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What was Washington's view of the president's relationship to party by the time he left office? Did he reconcile himself at all to the idea that he was a president with an opposition party in the form of Jeffersonian Republicans?
I'll start first with party, then go back to the greatness of the farewell address. He warns against party in the farewell address, not to say party should be abolished, should be outlawed. It's an echo to some extent of Federalist Number 10. Any government strong enough to eliminate parties and factions would be tyrannical. It's part of human nature and liberty and free government. That itself is an echo of Montesquieu's sketch of the English Constitution and party spirit and the spirit of laws. So it's to moderate, it's to temper, it's to remember that there are larger purposes than party, and that party could destroy the whole system, the whole constitutional system. So to that extent, there's a consistency in his last years in office, his second term, and in the farewell address and his final years, to never publicly identify himself as a Federalist, even though his body language, he walks like a duck, he talks like a duck. And Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, does classify Washington and Hamilton as the Federalist Party, and Madison and Jefferson as Democratic Republicans. But there's a consistency to Washington never himself identifying with party. To the greatness of the farewell address, today is September 19th, and that is the date in which the farewell address was published in a Philadelphia newspaper without the title, The Farewell Address. It was just dated September 19th, United States, friends and fellow citizens. And then he begins the farewell address. I would wish that every high school in the country, private or public or homeschooling, every college and university should read and teach and study this extraordinary document. I said he deliberately brings back together Publius. It's saying, I am doing my duty by resigning from public life. As I wanted to, he says, I asked to do this 4 years ago, and I'm doing my duty. I'm not failing in my duty. It would be good for all of you if we showed there was rotation in office. And then prays for the Union and the Constitutional Republic, makes various prayers, and then says, there, perhaps I should stop. But he says, in effect, in my first retirement, 1783, the circular letter, the final circular letter he writes as commander of the Revolutionary Forces to all the governors, circular letter, right? He had done the same thing. We won the war. Congratulations to all of us. Praying for the country. And here's some final advice. He had done it in 1783. So he says, well, you allowed me to do that the first time. There was a good reception to that. I'm going to do it again. And then, 4/5 of the document is the council. Series of councils, like 9 or 10 main points. And you just listed several of them. But he emphasizes liberty and says, I don't need to talk about that very much because you all love liberty. And the rest of it is about order. Mm-hmm. The Union, the Constitution, the separation of powers, and party, right? Because party undermines order, undermines the constitutional republic. So I think, in a way, I'm going to read back, and then finally the late parts that we really don't quote anything other than party from that early part in this today, in the 21st century. We do quote the phrase on religion and morality, those paragraphs, sometimes on support educational institutions, and occasionally the paragraphs on foreign policy. We quote, but we tend to misquote and misunderstand those as if he's an isolationist, which is wrong. But all of the more particular points are set up by liberty and then union and constitution and separation of powers. That's the foundation for warning about parties, for religion and morality, for public credit, for education, then the foreign policy. It's all on the basis of constitutionalism. So I think, in a way, Washington might appreciate what Van Buren does after Jackson was elected president, to bring some order. Mm-hmm. Parties are a reality, they're there, but we need to fit this into our constitutional order, which is there should be national parties, but they should be from the ground up. They should have federalism in them. State and local party people rise up into the national party, and the parties control the nominee for the major offices, especially for the presidency. It's not a plebiscite. It's experienced people in government who know the whole constitutional context and fabric, from local to state to national, and then they pick. And I think that fits pretty well with the spirit of what he's saying. Don't let parties be vehicles for demagoguery mm-hmm. and vehicles for hatred, because that's the path to destroying the constitutional order. Mm-hmm.
Well, it sounds like from the story we've told about Washington, he's one of those rare individuals that's great enough to establish an order, rule within it, right? Discipline his own conduct by sort of submitting himself to the rules of the game, to the constitutional order, but also by his own character, sort of bring it along, bring it to maturity and develop it. And that's a rare thing.
Can I finish with one little story?
Please do.
An American painter painting the portrait of George III mm-hmm. hears about the farewell address. George III says to this American painter, if that's true, knowing that Washington had resigned once from power, not going to be a Cromwell, if that's true, Washington is the greatest character of the age. This is George III.
Yeah.
And shortly after along comes this Frenchman named Napoleon, who in exile makes a disparaging remark about Washington. They wanted me to be a Washington. But if Washington had been in my situation, he never would have resigned from office because it was sort of, And he basically says, oh, it's easy. It was easy for Washington to resign. But I could never do it. Well, he's being a pompous ass, right? He's being Napoleon. Even Napoleon had to recognize the greatness of Washington and try and explain it away. Right? So George III and Napoleon both say, this is extraordinary that this immensely proud, ambitious, talented man resigns twice from very great power to allow constitutional government to be founded.
What a remarkable precedent. Well, thank you for helping us understand Washington's presidency, Paul. Thank you for visiting the center.
Thank you for
and
having
being
me.
part of what we do.
Thank you for all the work you're doing.